Why are you wasting your time on someone like him?" the man said loudly enough for the entire diner to hear, his voice cutting through the soft clatter of coffee cups and morning chatter. And I remember the exact moment the room fell quiet, because it wasn't just what he said, it was how easily he said it. Like kindness itself was something to be embarrassed by. And I was standing just a few feet away, holding my usual cup of black coffee, watching a young waitress freeze in place with a plate still in her hands, her eyes flickering between the man in the tailored coat and the old gentleman sitting alone in the corner booth, the same booth he sat in every morning at exactly 7:10 a.m., rain or shine, winter or summer, always ordering the same thing: scrambled eggs, toast, and a small orange juice, always counting his cash carefully before placing it on the table, like he didn't want to owe anyone anything. And yet it was never enough, not quite, not these days, and every single morning. Without fail, that same waitress would quietly cover the difference without making a scene, sliding the receipt under his cup with a soft smile, like she was protecting his dignity instead of paying his bill. And I had noticed it weeks ago, the way she treated him differently from the others, not with pity, not with impatience, but with a kind of respect that felt almost out of place in a busy roadside diner off Highway 61, where most people barely looked up from their phones. And I had also noticed something else, something I couldn't quite explain at first: the way the old man carried himself. Even in worn-out shoes and a coat that had seen better days, there was a quiet steadiness to him, a way he looked people in the eye, a way he said, "Thank you," like it meant something, like it used to mean something in a world that had slowly forgotten. And that morning, when the man, his son, as I would soon learn, walked in and shattered that quiet routine with a single sentence, everything shifted, because the waitress didn't back away. She didn't apologize or shrink like most people would when confronted like that. Instead, she set the plate down gently in front of the old man and said, calm but firm, "He's not a waste of time." And that was when the son laughed, a short, sharp laugh that didn't belong in a place like that, and shook his head as if the whole situation was beneath him. "You don't even know who he is," he said. And maybe that was true. Maybe none of us really knew. Not then, not yet. But I remember looking at the old man in that moment, expecting embarrassment or anger, or at least some kind of reaction. And instead, he just sat there quietly, his hands folded on the table, his eyes resting on the young woman who had just defended him. And there was something in that look, something steady and almost knowing, that made me realize this wasn't just a simple argument between a father and a son. This was something deeper, something that had been building long before that morning. And as I stood there, listening to the hum of the coffee machine and the uneasy silence spreading through the diner, I had the strangest feeling that the man everyone was so quick to dismiss was not who they thought he was at all, and that the biggest mistake in that room had just been made out loud for all of us to hear. I kept thinking about that moment long after the man left, the way his expensive shoes echoed across the tile floor while the door shut behind him like nothing had happened, like he had not just stripped the air out of the room with a few careless words. And yet the diner slowly returned to its rhythm, forks clinking, coffee pouring, conversations picking back up as if people preferred comfort over curiosity. But I could not shake the feeling that something important had just been revealed, and no one wanted to look at it too closely. And the old man, Henry Collins, sat there as he always did, finishing his meal in small, deliberate bites, his posture straight, his movements unhurried, as if time itself did not rush him the way it rushed everyone else. And the young waitress, Emily, moved around him with the same quiet care she always had, refilling his coffee before he asked, clearing his plate with a soft smile, never once mentioning what had just happened, never once making him feel like he needed to explain anything. And that, more than anything, caught my attention, because most people would have either backed away or tried to fix the situation with awkward words. But Emily did neither. She simply treated him exactly the same, as if respect was not something that could be taken away by someone else's opinion. And I found myself watching them more closely over the next few mornings, adjusting my own routine just to be there at the same time, ordering the same cup of coffee, sitting a little closer each day, not because I was being nosy, but because I needed to understand what I had seen. And it did not take long to notice that Henry was not like the other regulars. He did not complain about the food or the prices. He did not linger too long or rush out the door. And every so often, when Emily was not looking, He would glance around the diner in a way that felt almost familiar, like someone revisiting a place that once belonged to them, not physically, but in memory. And then there was the money, something small at first, easy to miss if you were not paying attention. The bills he used were always crisp, newer than the ones most people carried, folded neatly, counted with precision, and even when he came up short, just $1 or $2, there was no panic in his expression, no embarrassment, just a quiet acceptance, as if he understood something about his situation that the rest of us did not. And one morning, as I watched Emily slide a few extra dollars onto his check when she thought no one was looking, I noticed him pause before taking the receipt, his eyes lingering on her hand for just a second longer than usual. And then he nodded slightly, not in gratitude alone, but in recognition, like he was seeing something in her that he had been waiting for. And that was the moment I realized this was not just kindness on her part or routine on his. This was something else entirely, something unfolding slowly in plain sight. And whatever it was, it had nothing to do with the version of him his son had tried so casually to define, because people who have truly lost everything do not carry themselves like that. They do not sit so still in the middle of a storm they refuse to acknowledge. And as I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup that morning, I understood that I was no longer just an observer. I was part of something I did not yet understand, and I had a feeling it was only a matter of time before the truth made itself impossible to ignore. By the end of that week, the tension in the diner had settled into something quieter but far more unsettling, like a storm that had not passed but simply moved out of sight. And it was not long before Daniel returned, not once but 3 times in the span of 5 days, always arriving later in the morning, always dressed like he had somewhere more important to be, his presence sharp and out of place against the soft rhythm of regulars who came for comfort, not confrontation. And each time he walked in, the same shift happened. Conversations lowered, eyes flickered toward the corner booth, and Emily straightened just slightly behind the counter, as if preparing herself for something she refused to run from. And I began to understand that whatever existed between that father and son was not new. It was simply no longer hidden. And on the 3rd morning, I watched Daniel walk straight past the hostess stand without waiting to be seated, his eyes fixed on Henry with a kind of cold impatience that felt practiced, like this was a conversation he had already had many times before. And when he reached the table, he did not sit down. He did not greet his father. He simply placed a folded document on the table with 2 fingers and said, "We need to finish this." His voice low but firm, and Henry did not reach for the paper. He did not even look at it. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee and set the cup down with care before meeting his son's gaze in a way that made something in my chest tighten, because there was no fear there, no confusion, just a quiet refusal. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching longer than it should have, until Emily stepped closer with the coffee pot in her hand and asked, "Would you like a refill?" Not to Daniel, but to Henry, as if she had made a decision about who deserved her attention. And Daniel let out a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite. "You are still doing this," he said, glancing at her now. "Still playing caretaker?" And Emily did not flinch. She simply poured the coffee and said, "I am doing my job." But the way she said it made it clear she meant something more, and Daniel shook his head, turning back to his father. "You cannot keep pretending this is normal," he said, tapping the document again. "You signed everything over, remember?" And that was the first time I saw a change in Henry, not in his posture or his expression, but in the stillness around him, like the air itself had tightened, and he looked down at the paper briefly before lifting his eyes again. "I remember what I signed," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that did not match the situation Daniel was trying to create, something steady and controlled, and Daniel seemed to notice it too because his tone shifted, just slightly. "Then stop making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "You do not belong here anymore." And the words hung there longer than they should have, heavier than the earlier insults, because this was not just about pride or embarrassment. This was about place, about belonging, about erasing someone from a space they had once occupied without question. And I felt a chill run through me as I watched Henry lean back in his seat, his hands resting lightly on the table. And for the first time since I had been observing him, he looked not like a man being pushed out, but like a man who was allowing something to unfold exactly as expected. And in that moment, I realized that whatever Daniel thought he was controlling, he might not understand it nearly as well as he believed, and neither did the rest of us, not yet. After that morning, something shifted in the way I saw everything around me. Like once you notice a crack in the wall, you cannot pretend it is not there anymore. And I started paying closer attention not just to Henry, but to the space itself, the diner, the people, the small details that most of us ignore because they seem ordinary. And yet nothing about this situation felt ordinary anymore. And it was not until 2 days later that I noticed. The first piece that did not fit, because I arrived earlier than usual, just before 7, when the place was still half empty and the morning light had not fully settled through the front windows, and Henry was already there, sitting in his usual booth. But this time he was not alone. There was a man standing across from him, dressed in a dark suit, holding a leather folder, speaking in a low voice that did not belong in a place where people usually discussed breakfast specials and weather forecasts, and I could not hear everything they said, but I caught fragments, words like timing, authorization, and review, words that felt out of place when directed at someone Daniel had so confidently dismissed as having nothing left. And what struck me even more was the way Henry listened, not passively, not like someone being told what to do, but like someone evaluating information, asking quiet questions, nodding occasionally, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. And when the man in the suit finally handed him a document, Henry did not rush to sign it. He simply closed the folder and slid it back with a calm shake of his head, as if whatever decision was being discussed had already been made long before that morning. And when the man left, he did so with a kind of respect that lingered in the air, the kind of respect people do not offer to someone who has lost everything. And I remember standing there, pretending to stir sugar into my coffee that I had not yet tasted, realizing that the version of Henry we had all been seeing was only a fraction of the truth. And when Emily arrived a few minutes later, tying her apron as she stepped behind the counter, she greeted him the same way she always did, warm and genuine, completely unaware of what I had just witnessed. And for a brief moment, I wondered if she knew more than she let on. But the way she laughed softly at something he said, the way she leaned slightly closer when he spoke, told me she did not see him as anything other than what he appeared to be. And perhaps that was exactly why he trusted her presence in a way he did not trust anyone else. And later that morning, as I sat across the room watching him finish his meal, I noticed him take out his wallet again, the same worn leather, the same careful movements. But this time, as he counted the bills, one slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of a card tucked behind the cash, a dark card with a subtle metallic edge that caught the light for just a second before he slid it back into place. And I cannot explain why that detail stayed with me, but it did, because nothing about that card matched the story Daniel had been trying to sell. And as I sat there, the pieces beginning to align in ways I could not yet fully understand, I realized something simple but undeniable. This was not a story about a man who had lost everything. This was a story about a man who had allowed others to believe that he had. And there is a difference between those two things that most people never notice until it is too late. That afternoon I could not let it go. The image of that suited man, the tone of their conversation, the way Henry had declined to sign anything as if he was the one setting the terms, and it stayed with me in a way that ordinary curiosity does not. It felt heavier, like I had accidentally stepped into the edge of a story that had been unfolding long before I ever noticed it. And so the next morning, instead of simply observing, I did something I had not done before. I spoke to someone else about it. Not directly, not in a way that would sound intrusive, but carefully, the way you ask about something you already suspect has layers beneath it. And I chose the only person who seemed close enough to the situation without being guarded, the owner of the diner, a man named Carl who had been running the place for over 20 years, who knew every regular by name and every story by habit. And I waited until the morning rush slowed, until the sound of orders being called faded into the background, and I asked him, casually, that gentleman who comes in every morning, Henry, how long has he been coming here? And Carl paused longer than I expected, not confused, but thoughtful, like he was deciding how much to say. And then he wiped his hands on a towel and said, long enough. Which was not an answer, not really, but it told me more than if he had given me a number, and I leaned a little closer, lowering my voice. Do you know what he used to do? And Carl gave a short breath through his nose, something between a sigh and a quiet laugh. Depends who you ask, he said. And that was when I knew I was not imagining things. Because people who have nothing do not come with multiple versions of their past. And I pressed just a little further. And his son? And this time, Carl did not hesitate. Shows up when he wants something. He said simply, his tone flat in a way that carried more weight than any explanation. And that was enough for me to understand the direction of things, even if I did not yet know the full truth. And later that morning, as I watched Emily once again slide a few dollars on a Henry's bill, I saw something new in her expression, not doubt, not hesitation, but a quiet determination, like she had already made a decision about who he was, regardless of what anyone else said. And when Henry looked at her, there was that same recognition again, that same subtle acknowledgement that felt less like gratitude and more like confirmation. And I began to realize that whatever this situation was, it was not just about money or ownership or whatever document Daniel kept pushing across that table. It was about something deeper, something rooted in how people see each other when there is nothing obvious to gain. And as I sat there, listening to the low hum of conversation around me, I felt the pieces shifting again, slowly but steadily, and one thought settled in my mind with a kind of quiet certainty. If Henry had truly lost everything, there would be no reason for his son to keep coming back, no reason to push, no reason to demand signatures and decisions. And that meant only one thing. The story we had been shown was not the real one, not even close. And whatever Henry was holding on to, it was something Daniel could not afford to lose. It was the following Monday when everything began to tighten in a way that no one could ignore anymore, not even those who preferred to look the other way, because Daniel did not come in quietly this time. He came in early, earlier than I had ever seen him before, and he did not wait for the usual rhythm of the diner to settle around him. He walked straight to Henry's booth while the coffee was still being poured and the first plates were just leaving the kitchen, and there was something different in his posture, less controlled, more urgent, like whatever patience he had been pretending to have was finally wearing thin. And he placed another set of papers on the table, thicker this time, more deliberate, and said, "This ends today," not loudly, but with a firmness that made people nearby stop mid-sentence without realizing it. And Henry looked at the documents briefly before lifting his eyes, calm as always, and said nothing. And that silence seemed to irritate Daniel more than any argument could have, because he leaned forward slightly and added, "You do not get to drag this out anymore. You already agreed." And there it was again, that word, agreed, repeated like a tool meant to shape reality into something simpler than it actually was. And I watched Henry's hand move slowly across the table, not toward the papers, but toward his coffee cup, as if he was choosing his response carefully, not in words, but in timing. And before he could speak, Emily stepped in again, not interrupting, but present, setting down a fresh napkin, adjusting the edge of the plate. Small gestures that should have been invisible, but somehow carried weight in that moment. And Daniel noticed her. Of course he did. And his expression shifted into something sharper. "You need to stop encouraging this," he said, his tone clipped. "He is not who you think he is." And Emily met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I am not encouraging anything," she said. "I am just doing what is right." And the simplicity of that answer seemed to land harder than anything else that had been said, because for a brief second, Daniel had no response, and in that space, Henry finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "That is exactly the problem, Daniel," he said. And it was the first time I had heard him use his son's name in that way, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a kind of final clarity. And Daniel straightened slightly, his jaw tightening. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, and Henry looked at him for a long moment, as if measuring something invisible between them. "You have spent so much time deciding what matters," he said, "that you stopped recognizing it when it was right in front of you." And the words did not sound like an argument. They sounded like a conclusion, and I felt something shift again, deeper this time, because Daniel's reaction was not confusion. It was frustration, the kind that comes when something is slipping out of your control, and you cannot quite grasp why. And he tapped the papers again, harder now. "Just sign it," he said. And for the first time since I had been watching all of this unfold, Henry did something different. He did not ignore the document. He did not deflect. He reached out, placed his hand on it, and then slowly, deliberately, pushed it back across the table toward his son, and said, "No, and it was not loud. It was not dramatic, but it carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire room. And in that moment, I realized that whatever Daniel believed he was finalizing, he had just lost his last chance to do it quietly. The word no did not echo. It did not need to, because it settled into the room in a way that changed everything without raising its voice. And for a moment, Daniel just stared at his father as if he had misheard him, as if that single, quiet refusal did not fit into the version of reality he had been building piece by piece over the past few weeks. And I watched his expression shift, not into anger right away, but into something more uncertain, something closer to disbelief, because people who think they are in control rarely prepare for the moment when they are not. And he straightened slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the papers before pulling them back toward himself. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed, less sharp, more deliberate, like he was trying to regain footing he had just lost. "You do not understand what you are doing," he said, and Henry did not interrupt. He did not argue. He simply sat there with the same steady posture, his hands resting lightly on the table as if he had already considered every possible outcome and chosen this one anyway. And Emily stood just behind him now, not intruding, not speaking, but present in a way that felt quietly supportive. And that presence seemed to irritate Daniel again because he glanced at her briefly before focusing back on his father. "This is not about pride," he continued. "This is about reality." And Henry tilted his head slightly, not dismissing the statement, but acknowledging it in a way that made the next words land even more firmly. "You are right," he said. "It is about reality." And there was a pause then, a brief moment where even the background noise of the diner seemed to fade just enough for people to lean into the silence without realizing it. And Henry continued, "But not the one you have been trying to force." And I felt something shift again, deeper than before, because this was no longer a quiet resistance. This was the beginning of something being revealed. And Daniel seemed to sense it too, because his jaw tightened and he stepped back, slightly, creating a small distance between himself and the table as if he needed space to reassess. And that was when the door opened behind him and another man walked in, not hurried, not uncertain, but purposeful, dressed in a clean, well-fitted suit, carrying the same kind of leather folder I had seen days earlier. And he did not look around the room. He walked directly toward Henry's booth, stopping just beside it before offering a small, respectful nod. "Mr. Collins," he said, his voice calm and professional, and Daniel turned at the sound, his expression shifting instantly, not into recognition alone, but into something sharper, something that looked very much like concern. And the man in the suit placed the folder on the table, not in front of Daniel, but in front of Henry, opening it carefully and sliding a set of documents forward. And I could not see the details from where I sat, but I did not need to, because the change in the room was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a current had shifted direction without warning. And Henry glanced down at the papers, then up at Daniel. And for the first time since all of this had begun, there was something unmistakable in his expression, not anger, not triumph, but certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it has already decided what comes next. And Daniel took a step closer again, his voice lower now, controlled but strained. "What is this?" he asked, and the man in the suit answered before Henry could. "Documentation of authority," he said simply, and those 3 words seemed to land heavier than anything else that morning, because whatever Daniel thought he had secured, whatever version of control he believed he was finalizing, was no longer holding together the way it had just moments before. And as I sat there, watching the pieces fall into place in a way that felt both inevitable and completely unexpected, I realized that the story was no longer unfolding quietly. It was beginning to turn, and once something like that starts, it does not stop halfway. Daniel did not reach for the documents right away, and that hesitation said more than any reaction could have, because just moments earlier he had been pushing papers across that same table with confidence, with certainty, and now he stood there, looking at a folder that was not his, at terms he had not dictated, and for the first time since he walked into that diner, he looked like someone who was no longer sure of the ground beneath him. And the man in the suit remained still, composed, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the folder as if he had done this many times before, not in this place, not in this setting, but in rooms where decisions carried weight and consequences followed quietly but permanently. And Henry did not rush the moment. He did not explain or justify. He simply allowed it to unfold at its own pace, his eyes steady on his son, not with judgment, but with a kind of clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And when Daniel finally spoke, his voice was lower now, tighter. "You cannot be serious," he said. And Henry's response was immediate but calm. "I am." And there was no emphasis, no raised tone, just a statement that did not need reinforcement. And the man in the suit slid the top page slightly forward, turning it just enough for Daniel to see. "This confirms that Mr. Collins retains full authority over all primary holdings and operating decisions," he said. Each word measured, precise, and Daniel's eyes moved quickly across the page, scanning, searching, as if trying to find something that would contradict what he was hearing, something that would restore the version of control he believed he had secured. But whatever he was looking for was not there, and I could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his grip on his own papers tightened just slightly. And Emily, still standing nearby, said nothing, but her presence had changed, no longer just supportive, now quietly witnessing something larger than she had ever expected to be part of. And Henry leaned forward just a fraction, not to dominate the moment, but to meet it. "You thought transferring access meant ownership," he said, his voice steady. "But you never understood the structure behind it." And Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That is not how this works," he said. But even as he spoke, the certainty that had defined him earlier was no longer fully there. And the man in the suit responded calmly, "Actually, it is exactly how it works." And the simplicity of that correction seemed to settle something final in the air, because Daniel did not argue immediately. He did not push back the way he had before. He simply stood there, looking at the documents, at his father, at a situation that was no longer aligning with what he had expected. And Henry reached for his coffee again, taking a slow sip as if this was just another morning, as if nothing about this needed urgency. And when he set the cup down, he looked at Daniel one more time, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet finality that felt heavier than either. And in that moment, I understood something that had been building all along. This was never about reclaiming something lost. It was about revealing something that had never truly been taken in the first place. And as the silence settled once more over the table, it was clear to everyone in that room, whether they fully understood it or not, that the balance had shifted and there was no simple way back from it. For a long moment, no one moved, not Daniel, not Emily, not even the man in the suit. And it was as if the entire diner had paused just enough to witness something that did not happen every day, something quiet but irreversible. And Daniel finally looked up from the papers, his expression no longer sharp or dismissive, but unsettled in a way that revealed more than he probably intended. And he opened his mouth as if to argue, as if to push back one last time. But whatever words he had prepared did not come out the same way anymore, because the foundation beneath them was gone. And instead he said, slower now, "This does not change what you agreed to." And Henry did not respond immediately. He simply looked at him with that same steady gaze, the kind that had been there all along but had gone unnoticed until it mattered. And then he said, "It changes everything." Not louder, not stronger, just clearer. And that clarity seemed to settle into the space between them like something final, something that did not need to be repeated. And Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as if trying to reset the moment, to pull it back into something he could still control. But the control was already gone, slipping through in small, undeniable ways. And the man in the suit closed the folder gently, not with force, not with finality, but with a quiet professionalism that suggested the decision had already been documented, already been understood. And Emily stood there, her eyes moving between the two men, not fully grasping every detail, but understanding enough to feel the shift, to recognize that the man she had been helping all this time was not who others had claimed he was. And Henry reached into his pocket then, slowly, deliberately, and took out his wallet. The same worn leather, the same careful motion. But this time, instead of counting out bills, he placed it flat on the table and opened it, revealing not just the folded cash but the card I had glimpsed before, now fully visible. its dark surface catching the light in a way that felt unmistakable, and he slid it slightly forward, not toward Daniel, but toward Emily. "For the balance," he said quietly, and Emily hesitated for just a second, not because of the amount, but because of what the gesture meant now, because everything meant something different now, and she nodded softly, taking the card with both hands as if it carried more than just a payment. And Daniel watched that exchange, his expression tightening again. But not with the same certainty as before. This time, it was something closer to realization, something he could not undo. And Henry closed his wallet, standing up slowly from the booth, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and for a brief moment, he looked around the diner, not searching, not lingering, just acknowledging, as if he had been here not by accident, but by choice. And when his eyes returned to Daniel, there was no anger there, no accusation, just a quiet distance that had not existed before. "You should have paid attention," he said, and the words were simple, almost gentle, but they carried a weight that seemed to land deeper than anything else that had been said that morning. And then he turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with intention, and walked toward the door, the man in the suit following a step behind. And as the door opened and the morning light spilled in, I realized that what we had just witnessed was not a confrontation. Not really, it was a revelation, one that had been building in silence, piece by piece, until it could no longer be mistaken for anything else. And as the door closed behind him, the diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing felt quite the same anymore. Because once you see the truth for what it is, even in something as ordinary as a morning routine, you cannot go back to believing the version that was easier to accept.